What if everything you believe about the place you live was part of a carefully constructed illusion? Imagine waking up and realizing that the horizon does not curve, that the sky does not enclose a sphere but covers a plane, a disk, limited, contained, watched. You are surrounded by ice. The edges of the world do not lead to space, they lead to the end. A physical, impassable boundary where everything we know simply ends. Satellites, forged, space travel, stages, gravity, just a theory created to hide something much bigger. But why would they hide it? Who would benefit from an entire planet believing a lie as basic as its own shape? Some voices insist that there is something behind what we see. What if they are right? What would really happen to life, to science, to society, if we were stuck in a flat, still contained world? It seems crazy, but what if it's real? Now, I want to know from you, what if all this is true and we never realize it? Comment below, what do you think would change first if we discovered that the Earth was flat? Because there are hypotheses that place this theory much closer to reality than you might imagine. And in this video you will see why the simple idea of a flat Earth can shake the pillars of what we call scientific truth. And the scariest part is yet to come. If the Earth were flat, the rotation we know would cease to exist. This movement, responsible for generating the day and night cycle, would simply disappear. Without rotation, the planet would stop rotating around itself, and as a result, basic concepts such as hours, minutes, and time zones would become irrelevant. Time would no longer be a universal measurement and would depend on the position of each region in relation to the Sun, which, according to the flat Earth model, would not orbit the planet, but would move in circles over it, like a lantern rotating on a table. This would create an uneven and unstable light distribution. In this model, the Sun would be extremely small compared to the cosmic scale we know, something like the size of a city, floating just a few kilometers above the surface. This eliminates all logic behind solar and lunar eclipses, and makes the existence of seasons impossible. In the spherical model, the tilt of the Earth's axis in relation to the Sun perfectly explains why we have summer and winter in different hemispheres. On a flat Earth, with a fixed Sun rotating in a horizontal plane, this alternation would disappear. The entire current climate balance would no longer make sense. Furthermore, regions that currently receive different solar intensities throughout the year would be forced to live in an almost constant thermal regime, which would eliminate the large-scale agricultural cycle as we know it. There would be no spring, autumn, nor seasonal fluctuations that regulate ecosystems. This would cause complete dysfunction in the nature and lifestyle of human societies. What's more, this change would affect not only time as we perceive it, but also the entire logic that supports our calendars, clocks, and consequently, the organization of modern civilization. The very idea of synchronized global time would lose value. Routines would become fragmented. The concept of noon would cease to be a planetary reference point and would come to depend on a completely distorted geometry of sunlight. But this dynamic hides a consequence that few people know about, and it could put at risk the very structure of space-time as we understand it today. The idea of a flat Earth collides directly with one of the invisible pillars of the modern world: satellite navigation. GPS, a global positioning system, works based on dozens of satellites in synchronized orbit, which triangulate signals to determine the exact location of any object on the planet's surface. All of this depends on a spherical model, where satellites travel on predictable trajectories around a curving Earth. In a flat disk, this structure simply does not hold. Without curvature, there would be no stable orbit. Satellites could not rotate around anything. They would, in theory, need to float or be supported by technologies even more unlikely than the idea of a flat Earth itself. And this raises a practical question. How would planes guide themselves? How would ships find their destinations crossing oceans? How would cell phones maintain accurate location in real time? Much of the global digital infrastructure relies on the constant and precise operation of satellites. From weather forecasting to international banking synchronization, logistics operations and digital maps, all of this depends on orbital signals. Aviation, for example, uses navigation systems based on routes calculated by GPS, including for transoceanic routes, where there are no visual reference points. On a flat planet without satellites, navigation would rely on outdated, limited and highly flawed terrestrial methods. Real-time communication between continents would also be severely impacted. Without geostationary satellites, data transmissions between hemispheres would depend exclusively on submarine cables, which would limit speeds and increase failures. Global internet servers would become vulnerable to instability, and entire regions could become digitally isolated. A simple signal delay would no longer be an inconvenience and would represent the collapse of connectivity as we know it. Can you imagine a world without Google Maps, without GPS, without satellite Wi-Fi? Comment below, what would your daily life be like with all this offline? Now, if global tracking stopped working, what else would be operating without us knowing exactly where or who the signal is coming from? Gravity is one of the fundamental forces that shape the universe. It keeps planets in orbit, sustains the atmosphere, and defines the weight of everything that exists. In the spherical model, this force acts as a field that attracts all bodies to the center of the Earth. It is this attraction that ensures stability, balance, and predictability in the physical movements that we observe daily. But on a flat Earth, this logic collapses. If the planet were a disk, gravity couldn't pull objects toward a center because there wouldn't be a spherical center. Gravitational attraction, as we know it, would no longer make sense. For everything to remain attached to the ground, flat Earth theorists propose an alternative, that the entire planet would be propelled upwards with constant acceleration, simulating the sensation of weight. The most used comparison is that of an elevator going up continuously. But there is a serious problem with this hypothesis. Constant acceleration would require an infinite source of energy, which defies the most basic laws of physics. Furthermore, this model does not explain why objects of different masses fall at the same speed, nor why gravity varies with altitude. What's more, there is no record of any visible external force that could account for this upward thrust. The theory also ignores the effect of gravity on time, as has been measured by highly accurate instruments at different altitudes. Without a viable explanation, the proposal contradicts experiments already conducted and confirmed around the world. The absence of real gravity would also compromise basic natural phenomena. The water cycle, the flow of rivers, the sedimentation of the oceans. All of these depend on gravitational attraction acting consistently in all directions. In a flat world, these processes would be random or impossible to maintain, and if gravity did not behave as it does today, complex structures such as skyscrapers, bridges, or even airplanes in flight would lose stability. Nothing would work the way it does. But if gravity didn't exist as we know it, what else in physics would need to be thrown out? Perhaps we are not just facing a flaw in geography, but a complete reinterpretation of the forces that sustain the universe. At the heart of flat Earth theories is a recurring visual element, a giant wall of ice encircling the edge of the world. This supposed frozen edge would serve as a natural containment for the oceans, preventing water from flowing away into nothingness. Theorists argue that this wall would be what we know as Antarctica, not a continent, but an insurmountable ice frontier. But this structure, in addition to being unlikely, raises a more troubling question. What if it failed? Without the curvature of the planet, and without gravity pulling everything toward a center, the containment of water would no longer depend on internal physical forces and would depend exclusively on this wall. The ocean, by definition, is unstable. It moves, expands, and reacts to atmospheric pressure, temperature, and wind. On a flat planet with no coherent gravitational field, keeping billions of liters of water confined to a horizontal surface would already be an absurd challenge. If any section of the ice edge collapsed, the imbalance would be immediate. The rupture would release extreme water flows beyond the disk's boundaries. There would be no containment or return. The hydrosphere would collapse. Ocean currents would cease to circulate, aquatic ecosystems would be destroyed, and the global food chain would lose its foundation. The climate would change dramatically. Coastal regions would suffer massive flooding, and previously wetlands would turn into salinized deserts. Agriculture would be disrupted, freshwater supplies would collapse, and the number of human lives directly impacted would surpass any catastrophe ever recorded. But there is an even deeper layer to this scenario. The very idea that the ocean can fall outside the planet redefines what we understand by horizon. It stops being a distant point that we never reach and becomes a physical limit with an edge, an end, and a risk. Looking at the sea would stop being contemplation and would become restlessness. Have you ever imagined a world where the horizon has an end, where looking beyond can mean seeing the abyss? If you've made it this far, it's because you understand the importance of questioning what we take for granted. This video isn't just a theory, it's an investigation into the invisible structures that underpin reality as we know it. By clicking the like button, you're strengthening a space where different thinking is valued, where science and mystery meet to challenge old certainties. This simple gesture helps YouTube bring this content to more people who, like you, feel that there's still a lot to be discovered. Because there is evidence, real, documented, that part of what we call the stable world may just be a convenient construct. And what you'll discover now may indicate that we're closer to the edge than we realize. What if that frozen edge wasn't just made of ice, but silence? A silence that hides something we should never reach. The hypothesis of a flat Earth survives not only through the denial of science, but through the argument that a great conspiracy has been active for decades, perhaps centuries, to keep humanity convinced that it lives on a sphere rotating in space. According to this vision, space agencies, governments, scientific institutions, media, and even education sectors would be committed to an alleged hoax. The question that arises is, what would be the purpose of hiding something as basic as the shape of the planet? Theorists argue that narrative control is actually perception control. If people believe in a reality that they cannot verify with their own eyes, they become dependent on official sources to understand the world. This paves the way for a centralized authority to define what is real and what is not. In this scenario, the spherical model would be more than a scientific explanation. It would be a tool of symbolic domination. Another common thread in these theories is the role of space exploration. If space as we imagine it does not exist, trillion-dollar investments in satellites, space stations, and interplanetary missions would be a smokescreen to keep the illusion alive. For conspiracy theorists, these actions do not serve to expand knowledge, but to constantly reaffirm the official version of reality. And the more this version is affirmed, the more unquestionable it becomes, even without direct evidence accessible to the average citizen. Criticism goes beyond science. Many believe that the erasure of the Earth's true form would be linked to something bigger, preventing humanity from discovering its real purpose, its origin, or its position in the cosmos. The hiding of the flat world would be, for these groups, the hiding of something more, something that would redefine history, religion, and human identity. The question that remains is disturbing. In a world where so many lies have been debunked over time, why would this one endure for so long? And why would so many governments, even political opponents, maintain the same discourse? But what if the lie is told so well that the truth becomes impossible to see? Perhaps the secret is not just in what they tell us, but in what they stop letting us see. If the Earth were flat, with physical edges, visible boundaries, and a fixed sky overhead, the impact would not be just scientific or technological, it would be existential. The mere idea of living in a closed plane would radically change our perception of infinity. The universe would cease to be an expanding expanse and become a bounded structure, perhaps constructed, perhaps controlled. This would reopen long-standing questions that science had left behind. Who defined these boundaries? Why? Ancient religions, which described the Earth as a plane covered by a celestial vault, would gain new weight. Biblical cosmology, for example, which speaks of the waters above the firmament, would no longer be read as a metaphor and would return to the center of debate. Sacred texts from various traditions, previously considered symbolic, would be reinterpreted as possible literal descriptions of a reality that has always been in sight, but has been ignored. This would cause clashes between established beliefs and modern scientific models, reigniting conflicts between faith and reason on a global scale. From a philosophical point of view, the notion of a world with a physical end would force us to review our position in the cosmos. Instead of being travelers in a universe without borders, we would become inhabitants of a closed, fenced space, where everything that exists is visible or controlled. This would redefine the sense of freedom, purpose, and transcendence. The sky would stop being a symbol of expansion and become a barrier. The idea of destiny, origin, and even divinity would be remodeled. Psychologically, the feeling of living on a kind of cosmic chessboard would have profound impacts. The loss of the illusion of infinity could generate collective anguish. The knowledge that there is a physical, tangible end could provoke existential crises, a feeling of imprisonment and widespread distrust. Trust in modern knowledge would collapse, and the human mind would have to adapt to a new way of understanding its own existence, limited, contained, and monitored. How would you feel if you discovered that everything had an end, even heaven itself? What if this end was so close that we were already living in its shadow, without realizing it? The idea that there are physical limits to the universe is not just unsettling. It opens up something even more disturbing. What if the entire cosmos is part of something larger, with layers we can't yet access? Now I want to hear you. What mysterious hypothesis about the universe has crossed your mind? Those ideas that seem too crazy to say out loud, but that deep down make you think, what if it's true? Comment below, because some of these theories can, yes, be transformed into new videos here. Let's build together this space where thinking differently is what moves us. The balance of natural phenomena that we observe daily, from the movement of the winds to the seasons, from ocean currents to the polar auroras, is directly linked to the shape and tilt of the Earth. The atmosphere circulates because the planet rotates. The oceans follow complex patterns because there is gravity pulling in all directions, because there is rotation, and because the sun illuminates each part of the Earth at different angles throughout the year. If the Earth were flat, this structure would completely collapse. Without curvature, there would be no hemispheres with opposite climates. Without the tilted axis, there would be no seasons. The sun, moving in circles on a flat disk, would not provide thermal energy in a balanced way. Areas that are currently tropical could go into permanent cooling, while cold regions would be exposed to extreme heat. The global climate would become unstable, chaotic, and unpredictable, not because of natural variations, but because the mechanisms that currently regulate temperature, humidity, and atmospheric pressure would stop working. Northern lights, for example, depend on the interaction between the Earth's magnetic field and solar particles, something that requires a spherical and magnetized planetary core. In a flat world with an undefined internal structure, this field would not exist or would be extremely weak. And without it, our planet would be vulnerable to solar radiation, making entire regions uninhabitable over time. Eclipses would also become difficult to explain. Perfect alignment between the Sun, Earth, and Moon, possible only in a three-dimensional system with well-defined orbits, would be impossible in a flat scenario. Explaining the disappearance of the Sun or Moon by shadows on a fixed plane would require a complete rethinking of how we understand light, distance, and geometry. These changes would directly compromise agriculture. Without climate predictability, growing food at scale would be impossible. Irrigation systems, planting routines, rainfall distribution, everything would no longer follow standards. Deserts would emerge where forests now exist. Geographic borders would transform into zones of instability. Mass food production would collapse. Without the natural forces that shape life, what would be left of civilization? Could we survive the absence of everything that until now we have always taken for granted? Or are we about to realize that the planet's stability depends on more than just the climate? If the Earth were flat and all the evidence that currently supports the spherical model were in fact dismantled, the consequence would be much more profound than simply reviewing a map. We would be facing the complete collapse of modern science. Everything we know about physics, astronomy, geology, and cosmology would need to be rewritten, not just tweaked, rebuilt from the ground up. Gravitational physics would no longer have a basis. The concept of mass attracting mass, Newton's equations, and Einstein's relativity would all lose their meaning. The behavior of light, the curvature of space, time as a dimension, all of these would become obsolete. Even everyday events, such as the movement of a ball or the falling of an object, would require different explanations. The universe, as we understand it, would cease to exist as a reliable structure. Astronomy would face an even greater challenge. The idea of an organized solar system with planets orbiting the Sun would have to be abandoned. It would not be enough to explain the movement of the stars. It would be necessary to justify how celestial bodies move in a fixed firmament, or who moves them, and by what mechanism. Alternative models would emerge, trying to simulate a new order of the cosmos. But to date, none of them have managed to reproduce the phenomena with the precision of current models. In this scenario, two exits would become inevitable. The first would be to admit that our understanding has always been a convenient construct, shaped to maintain social cohesion and global order. The second would be to accept that reality is not what we think, but what we have been allowed to perceive. What if the current model is just a functional representation within an artificial reality? The idea that we live in a simulation, controlled, limited, managed by a system that determines what we can and cannot observe, would begin to gain ground. Not as science fiction, but as a logical alternative to justify a universe that insists on not behaving as expected. If we had to rewrite all the rules of the universe, who would you trust to write them? What if the new laws are already in use, but applied on another level of reality, invisible to our senses? Perhaps what we call science is just the instruction manual for the most superficial layer of what actually exists. If this content has changed the way you understand the universe, then you are already part of a rare group, the kind of person who questions, investigates, and is not satisfied with ready-made answers. Now it's your turn to spread this. Share this video with those you know who also see beyond the obvious. Maybe no one is talking about this, but you could be the first to raise the right question. If the Earth were flat, nothing, absolutely nothing would work as we know it. There would be no stable climate, no working satellites, no consistent physical laws. But the true impact of this hypothesis is not just the scientific collapse it would imply, it's shaking our confidence in the realization that everything we take for granted may be based on fragile structures supported by consensus, convenience, or control. The purpose of this video was never to convince you that the Earth is flat. It was to make you think about what happens when we question what we have always been told is unquestionable. Because sometimes the best way to understand the truth is by confronting madness. After all, what if we're wrong about the shape of the Earth? What else could we be wrong about? The universe is full of questions that we cannot even formulate yet. And that is precisely why being here has such great value. Being a part of this is more than just watching videos. It is going on a journey where each hypothesis opens a new door, each discovery changes the course of the conversation, and each theory challenges everything that has ever been accepted as truth. If you want to continue exploring these possibilities with depth, clarity, and boldness, activate the bell and sign up now. Because here, the next question always leads further, and there is much more waiting for you. Now, if this has made you question reality, click on the video that is appearing on your screen. What comes next could change not only what you believe, but how you perceive time, space, and what's really behind it all.